Thank you very much for having me along, everyone. Bear with me, please. I've just spent 4 months in the field where I don't do a lot of talking, and so my vocal folds are falling apart because I've been having some fascinating discussions with everybody over the last couple of days. But hopefully we'll get through it. So I'm Kat Hobaiter. My research group is the Wild Minds Lab. And what we're probably best known for is our work on wild ape gestural communication. That means a lot of what I'll talk about today is centered in that ape gesture data. But actually, I think the core principles that we're thinking about are going to apply to a lot of different systems. I've spent, I realized this Christmas, 20 years now working with wild apes. And I spend about half the year out there with them. So I work with chimpanzees and gorillas in the forests and mountains in Africa. And I just have the immense privilege, really, of living alongside them and to whatever extent I can, embedding and integrating into their world. And a lot of the questions that I have asked, and certainly what I will put on a grant application from time to time, is I'm going to get at the evolutionary origins of human language, blah, blah, blah. What I really care about is understanding the apes themselves. What I really want to know is I see their communication and understanding their communication as a way to access their minds, a way to know what they're thinking about, a way to know how they see each other and the world around them. So I'm really excited just to center the apes today. Probably the most important thing just to mention up front is everything I do is part of a huge team of people. And all of the research I get to share with you today isn't possible without any of them. So just, a big thank you up front to everybody who participates in this with us. Okay, I'm going to set the scene a little bit because we're moving out of the vocal domain into gesture. And in many cases, a lot of information systems, a lot of systems of communication, information gets broadcast, right? It's put out into the world. I think of it a little bit like a radio. You're throwing out information. That information can be rich, it can be incredibly detailed, but you're not necessarily knowing or having a lot of information on who your audience is or what they're doing. Now, we make those kind of broadcast signals too, right? So if I'm in a kitchen and I pick up a pan on the stove and it's too hot and I yelp and you're sat in the kitchen, you get information from the signal that I'm broadcasting, but I didn't intend to communicate it to you. I would have yelped if there was nobody else in the kitchen. I might yelp a bit louder, a bit longer. I might suppress swearing too more colorfully, depending on the audience. But fundamentally, I'm not communicating to you in a language-like way. Because what I can do with language is 2 hours later, when my hand doesn't hurt anymore and I see someone come in the kitchen, I can say, watch out, the pan is hot. And that's not a stimulus triggered kind of signal. And the interesting thing that I can do is I can choose to tell the person that just came in, but not you, because I know you already know. So what we do with that kind of intentional communication is I'm sharing information and ideas with a partner towards a specific goal. And it really revolutionized our understanding of non-human communication when we started to realize in the 80s and 90s that great apes are using their gestures in that intentional language-like way. When an ape's gesturing, they're gesturing to someone, right? But how do we recognize that in another species? Because we don't have access to their minds, we don't have access to what they're thinking about. But we do have clear behavioral indications of intentional communication that we're looking to detect and that we can apply. So if I make an analogy with my use of language again, imagine that I'm asking you to pass me the coffee, something we're probably all feeling the need for at about this point in the afternoon. Now, my need for coffee is essentially a constant. So the stimulus leading to that signal production is just always there. But hopefully, if I'm communicating with you, what I'm not just doing is broadcasting coffee, 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 coffee out at you, unless it's really early in the morning. What I would do if I'm communicating to you is I say, please, could you pass me the coffee? And I wait for you to reply, that response waiting. And then if you don't pass me the coffee, I might persist. I might ask you again. If you do something like you refuse or you get confused or you pass me the decaf, I might elaborate, adding a point or something more to it. So what we can see there is a pattern of communication with response waiting, persistence, elaboration that's going to let us identify this type of intentional communication. And we can apply those same patterns of behavior detection to the apes that we're working with and see that they are doing that with their gestural communication. I can also use those same patterns of behavior to start to decode what the signal means if I don't know what the coffee signal is, for example. Because meaning is not just about the context the signal is produced in. It's not even about what happens next after I produce it. Because if I asked you for the coffee, you might tell me to get lost. You might, as I said, pass me the decaf. None of that is what I meant to communicate. But what we see is if over dozens and hundreds of cases, there is one outcome, or maybe a couple of outcomes, that will reliably stop me from signaling, that's going to give me a clue about the signaler's intent. So essentially, we're looking for what are the behavioral changes that stop the signaler from communicating as a way to access what they intended to communicate in the first place. And so this common use of intentional meaning at the heart of both language and ape gesture meant that the study of gestural communication in great apes seemed initially a really good way to look at how we might be able to decode communication in other species using language-like frameworks. And ape gesture is an incredible system. They have well over 100 different gestural signals. And over the past decade, we've been able to decode what those gestures mean, to see that those meanings are flexible, to look at how they're combining gestures with each other. But the more that I worked on it, the more I really started to get bothered, and the more that I worried that essentially the approach we've taken to comparative communication is not going to get us an answer to the question of how we might translate what a chimpanzee is going to say on any given Tuesday, right? We're describing the system a species has available to them. We're describing the tools in the species toolkit. But if we want to understand meaning in others, I think we need to be looking at how other species and how we use those tools day to day. I love this quote by Sidney Brenner, and I overuse it, but it's perfect for the analogy I want to make. And he said the difference between the telephone directory and a Shakespeare play is that while both have a grand cast of characters, only the play has a plot. Right now, he was talking about DNA, but this analogy works so beautifully for the questions that I want to get at meaning. Because meaning in language is not only about the grand cast of characters. It's not about the tools in your toolbox. It's all about the plot. And I think it's the way that our identities, our relationships, our social world shapes the communication that we produce that makes human and maybe other species use of meaning so distinctive. So to get to grips with how we might decode similar meaning in other species, we have to get stuck into a different way of studying communication when we're looking at them. Forgive me here, we're going to take a brief aside into some Gricean linguistics. But one very characteristic use of how a human creates meaning in language is that there's a distinction between what we would call the timeless meaning of a word or gesture and its occasion use. So timeless meaning is essentially the kind of what it means in general. It's the big picture, average meaning across uses. The occasion meaning is the meaning of a word under a specific set of circumstances. And that flexibility, our ability to take one word and to produce it in exactly the same way and have it mean something completely different, is a really distinctive feature of meaning in human communication. So if we're going to illustrate this distinction, imagine that it gets late tonight, you're driving back down to Santa Fe, it's a country road, somebody flashes their lights at you, and what are they trying to tell you, right? If you want to decode this message, there is no direct correlation between that signal and something happening in the world around you that is consistent. There could be a sort of vague, timeless meaning, I suppose, like a hey, pay attention. But you have to think about what the driver wants you to understand on that specific occasion of use, right? So it could be multiple things. It could be a friend that recognizes you and is just saying, hey. Someone could be telling you there's a problem with your car. They could also be warning you that there's danger up ahead and you need to slow down. Your response to them flashing their lights and making that same signal in each of those three circumstances needs to be different. Now, we can work this out, right? Because you can check their car, you don't recognize it, it's not your friend. You can check your car, hopefully it's not on fire. And so you can infer that on this occasion of use, they're telling you there's something up ahead and you need to slow down. There's an accident or a police car around the corner or something. And we do this all the time with language. We are constantly co-constructing meaning, a specific meaning together in the moment, even while the signal remains exactly the same. So If I came up to you and I said nice shoes, then if I had just said hello, nice shoes, that's a compliment. If I said exactly the same words with the same intonation, nice shoes, 2 seconds after you asked me if I liked your new jacket or your new hat, that's going to mean something very different, right? So we can use these signals very flexibly, and what we're doing there is always co-constructing meaning in a social interaction. Okay, now here's the rub. Our work on the structure of communication in other species, on the tools they have in their toolkit, is a great way to get at timeless meaning. I can tell you what a chimpanzee arm raise means. I can tell you what an elephant rumble means. But we do that through getting rid of variation between individuals, between occasions, between groups. Variation is seen as this problem in our data set that we have to average out or get rid of. But that will never allow us to get to the fundamental question of what someone from another species means on that Tuesday at 12:15 when they use that signal, right? So to do that, we need to embrace all of the chaos, all of the noise in our data, and just get to grips with all of that. So part of the reason that it's taken us so long, to be fair, is to do this, you need a lot of data. And we've been seeing some incredible sized data sets, and we're getting to that point as a community where we're able to generate them. Excuse me. So over the past 5 years or so, the Wild Minds Lab has been very busy annotating about 25,000 cases of wild ape gesture. We've been building the biggest data set that we could try to build. We're doing this manually, and every gesture token has at the moment about 60, 65 different labels on it. I now have the equivalent of a swear jar that I have to put quite a lot of money in if I ask anybody to add anything to the coding scheme. But we've been doing this across species, across groups, across individuals, landscapes, generations, and we're building that variation in as a feature of what we code. So a first step when we started to do this was to build our gesture units from the bottom up. So we now describe them in incredibly fine-grained detail, and then we lump up to discrete units, not based on what we've traditionally done in animal communication, which is come at this with a human predefined ethogram of signal A, B, C. No, we use the massive data sets of ape behavior we have to essentially help us using latent clustering algorithms to define the boundaries around a unit that makes sense to the species using that unit. So we can start to tackle questions using repertoires of relevant units in that gestural data. And actually, when we did this for Eastern chimpanzees earlier this year, we doubled the number of units that we thought were present in the system. We thought it was 60, 70, and they actually have over 140 discrete gestural units that they are consistently differentiating between. That's allowing us to look at nuance in production, at things that might resemble accent, dialect, timing. Do you have a slow country drawl kind of chimpanzee? So what I'm going to try and do now is just give you a little whistle-stop tour of the ways in which deliberately looking at variation has been opening new doors for us and really enriching our understanding of ape gesture. Sometimes variation in ape gesture is going to be shaped by really obvious things. If you are an arboreal orangutan, you need a bit more flexibility because your limbs are occupied in that three-dimensional space than you do if you're a terrestrial chimp. Some stuff is easy. Some stuff is a bit more nuanced, though. We can also see that within a species, between different social groups, things like your group size, your group structure, and your cohesion are going to shape how you communicate. What you're looking at here is the optimality of gestural signals in different chimpanzee communities. And we can see that in very small, very cohesive groups, gesturing is highly optimized, highly efficient, whereas in very large groups, particularly those that seem to have additional levels of social structure, we actually see counter-optimization patterns, patterns that suggest that they're investing extra energy in a sort of costly signaling, which is very similar to what we see when we get to more complex structured human societies. We can also see that, too many, there we go. We can also see nuanced variation that is starting, and I use the word with a bucket load of salt right now, but it's starting to look like we might have accent or dialect variation between communities. So a common chimpanzee gesture is leaf clipping. You're basically tearing up leaves. It is the chimpanzee way of flirting. That is how you get a girl, basically. Do with that information what you wish. But it turns out that if you get stuck into the details of how that leaf is torn through the middle, at the end, pulled off, then you get a lot of interesting variation when you start to look at the different groups. Some of those ways of doing it are more quiet than others. Maybe you want to be a little sneaky depending on who's around with your flirting. But when we look at these leaf clipping in two neighboring communities of chimpanzees in the Budongo forest in Uganda, we saw a consistent difference in the pattern of use. So the Sonso chimpanzees are leaf clippers, and the Waibira chimpanzees are leaf pullers, give or take.
2 minutes.
Thank you. So first of all, this is really lovely evidence for stable group differences in the way a gesture is expressed. But we were actually lucky enough to have two of our Sonso-born females who moved to Waibira and who did not miss a beat and switched from being leaf clip understanders to leaf pull understanders. So we think this kind of stuff is really promising. We see individual variation. So chimpanzees have signature drumming styles. I know that that top one is Eler if I hear him because he's a double beat guy, whereas Tristan is more of a classic 4/4 drummer. So they have their individual stable signature styles, but we're seeing variation that we have no idea how to explain. So the data in blue there are West African chimpanzees who are highly isochronous. Data in brown are East African chimpanzees. They're a little more free form about their drumming styles. And we don't know why there's a difference. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with ecology or drumming substrate or anything else. And finally, we have been able to show that while ape meanings are flexible, on any one occasion of use, they're not ambiguous to the apes using them. So just as we did earlier with the car light flashing example, they are incorporating social context to define meaning on a specific occasion of use. Okay, so these are just a few examples of where embracing the noise in our data allows us to ask much richer questions about how other apes are using their gestures. And with big enough data sets, we can open up all kinds of new questions. For example, we can investigate the ways in which both humans and other species establish, shape, and share social identity in communication. And I think actually the most distinctive use of human language, or the reasons for it, through which it might have emerged, had nothing to do with the usual kind of hunting, politicking, gossip type explanations. I think other species are doing all of that. And I actually think that fireside storytelling is one of the most interesting uses of human language. I think it's where we fundamentally shifted the scale and scope of the meaning that we were communicating in a way that we don't yet recognize in other species. It's where our species' characteristic use of communication emerged. But we actually don't know if other species are doing this. The question I would love to answer is there anything like a storytelling chimpanzee? What would they tell each other? What would they talk about? How do we, at a sort of early entry into that, start to identify what it means to communicate who we are and who they are, us and them, my identity, our identity, their identity, through your communication? Are other species doing that same kind of thing? Now, to answer those kind of questions, we need even bigger data sets, and that means going beyond my lifetime, my group's lifetimes worth of data. And so how do we actually get that work done? So I'm just going to finish up by saying that we are starting to have more success now, training models that are basically automating some of this data collection. We actually see this as a responsibility that we have because the species I'm working with are highly endangered. So we see these as data arcs. These are ways of preserving behavior, culture, and communication in other species. But in order to be a useful data arc, that data must be accessible. And so to extract that data, we need to learn how to automate it at some level. And so we're getting there. We're starting to look at aspects of gesture production we haven't even thought about how to describe yet. But I'm really excited to take that next step. So just, sorry, to finish up, I think social identity is key to getting at the plot in other species communication. I think it's what's going to take us beyond this just grand cast of characters approach. And just because I can never resist quotes, my favorite Douglas Adams one, this is where I think I am, at least in my research, which is it might have taken me 20 years to get to the point where I think I now know how to start to ask the questions that I should have probably been asking all along. But thank you very much.
Two quick questions. One is,
You didn't tell us what measure of optimality you were using, but I think it was something to do with how much energy was going into the gesture or energy per unit or something. My other question is, for storytelling, could we try giving them puppets?
Well, they tried with Coco had finger puppets, right? So the optimality one's the easy one, so I'll tackle that first. It's just duration at the moment. So we're looking at different timings within the gestures. One of the things that I'd like us to be able to start to do with some of the pose estimation tracking is possibly to be able to find a way to look at gesture size and speed so that we can get a better measure of energy investment and not just duration, but it's duration per unit at the moment. I think if we gave them puppets and we gave those to the kind of apes that would be willing to use them, we might end up finding out if they could tell us the kind of stories, tell us human stories. I want to know what the wild apes are talking to each other about. So I think the way in which to come at this is to think about how are they based. It's just, for me, stories are about who we are. It's about thinking about who I am and who we are. And so that aspect of identity within communication and how that's shared and established is the kind of angle I'd like to start with on it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Kata. What a wonderful talk. I have many questions, but one quick short one. You finished saying, well, social identity is fundamental to the communication pattern of a social ape, obviously. I'm wondering what examples you can think of changes in gestural communication that were concomitant with changes in social identity of animals. For example, an oviparous female that then gives birth, becomes a mother, a dominant male that has high hierarchy and that falls in the hierarchy, and which were the gestural changes that you saw with those changes in identity?
That's a really good question. And the honest answer is that I think we're starting to be able to ask them. Anecdotally, I see shifts through, I'm really lucky. There are now individuals, I've known them since they were kids. I know they're kids, so I get that sense of their lifetime arc a little bit. So I've seen, females that are pregnant will sometimes shift in their use of gestures so you'll get pregnant females soliciting other females. You'll get kind of shifts in role across a lifetime. So our females will also go through something like menopause. That will shift their role in the group. And sometimes that's about shifting it into a new dimension, and sometimes that's about shifting it in a way that's quite familiar, but for a role that somebody else might have taken on. So whether that's more male typical or for younger individuals, seeing alpha males, and depending on what kind of alpha you are, depends a lot on what happens to you when you lose your alpha ship. But seeing alpha individuals who become almost, I suppose, like grandfather figures, they just move out of the social politics, and all of that is nonsense, but they're still respected. So the distinction between you are the boss and I'm going to greet you versus you're not the boss anymore, but I respect you and you're going to receive greetings in those ways. I think there's a lot of nuance in there that we're missing. And also with the apes, like with many of the species we've been hearing about, it takes decades to get a sense of what that lifetime is. So it is now that we're starting to have the kind of data sets to ask those questions.
Ben, one more.
Thank you. This was a really fascinating talk. The thing I wanted to double check with you is whether the gesture vocabulary has high fidelity in the sense that multiple entities and multiple animals consistently use the same gestures for what appears to be the same purpose. Is that clear in your mind that these are I don't know whether to use the word precise or not, but are they quite distinguishable and repeatable across members of the group?
Yes, definitely. So the core gesture actions and even the ways in which they're produced in terms of articulated flexion are really stable. So I think a lot of it actually is likely biologically inherited at a sort of phoneme kind of analogy level, that all chimpanzees are born with the ability to produce the same rough set of gestures. And then how you use them, what you do with them, how you express them, there's a lot of evidence for learning in the lifetime but you have an available set of units, and that available set is very consistent. And we actually see consistency across all the 8 species. So chimpanzees and bonobos overlap almost perfectly. When you go down to gorillas, you get about 85% overlap. So we have some really lovely data that we're working with now with humans, where we show that 1 to 2-year-old humans, just as language is coming online for them, are using about 40 or 50 of the 8 gestures. And we also just threw up, and we did this online study where we threw up these gestural videos and we asked people if they could understand what they meant. A lot of people took part. So I think we had about 15,000 people in the end. So we kind of crashed the servers initially. Turns out people really like watching videos of apes online. But we were really kind of salty about this because we added all of this extra context and extra information because we thought this would be a puzzle that was too hard for people who are not used to working with apes to solve. I've spent most of my time telling students you're going to have to commit like years to become a good, reliable coder of ape gesture. It's really hard. We worked really hard at this to develop this expertise, and it turns out that members of the public online are well above chance. They're doing this extremely well, which on the one hand is the greatest inter-observer test ever. Everybody else sees what we see, and we're instinctively able to recognize those units. And on the other hand, did make us a little bit salty about how much work we've been putting to years. So, but I do think they're, reliable, robust, repeatable units, definitely.
So
Thank you.